The plaza at the foot of Olvera Street in Los Angeles had benches, shade, and two ways out. On the 26th of February 1931, about 400 people were sitting there, eating and waiting for work. At 3 o'clock, federal immigration officers and Los Angeles police sealed both entrances and let nobody leave. Men in olive uniforms moved along the benches, asking each person for a name and a passport. Moises Gonzalez, a department store employee, took out the papers proving he had been admitted to the country legally in 1923. The officer pushed the papers back at him. Gonzalez expected the papers to settle it. He had carried them for 8 years because he had been told they were the thing that mattered, and on that afternoon, they did not matter at all. He was put into a van with the others, driven to the central police station, and left in a cell while officers argued about whether to hold him as a communist. Nothing in his file supported that. Nothing needed to. He was let out that evening, still holding the papers, into a main street that had emptied and stayed empty for hours after the officers left. 17 people were taken from the square that afternoon, and almost all of them were free again within days. By any ordinary measure of an immigration operation, it was a waste of an afternoon. It was recorded inside the county government as a success, and it was one, because the 17 were never the objective. The 400 were. 10 months earlier, the city had opened a Mexican marketplace on the street running north out of that square, and it was an instant success with tourists. The oldest house in Los Angeles still stands 100 feet from the benches, saved from the wrecking ball in those same years, by the same city, in the name of preserving Mexican Los Angeles. Both of those things are still there. So is a wall a short walk away that a painter covered with the whole argument in 1932, and that the city painted white before the paint had properly dried. Within a month of that afternoon, the first train left Los Angeles, carrying people who had bought no ticket, signed no order, and been given no hearing. Nobody made them go. That was the point. Los Angeles began at this square, and the founding is not in dispute. In 1781, 44 settlers arrived from what was then northern Mexico and established a pueblo on the river. They were of Mexican, African, Spanish, and indigenous descent, and most of them could not sign their own names. The plaza was moved and rebuilt more than once over the following century, but the function never changed. It was the room the town met in. By the 1850s, the district north of the square had a name, Sonora Town, after the Mexican state that most of its people had come from during the gold rush, when miners moved north to California and then south again after being driven off their claims. It was adobe and one-story shacks and dirt. Anglo Los Angeles wrote about it the way cities always write about the quarter they do not live in. And by 1924, a guidebook could still place it precisely, running along North Main Street from Temple Street down to the old plaza, meeting Chinatown on one side and Little Italy on the other. The church on the west side of the square had stood there since the 1820s. Everyone called it La Placita, the Little Plaza, and the name attached itself to the square as well. On a Sunday, the square held christenings coming out of the church, vendors, arguments, political speeches from men standing on boxes, and musicians who worked the crowd for coins. The historian Doug Monroy put the point about as plainly as it can be put, which is that in the days before television and radio, if you wanted stimulation and excitement, you went to La Placita. Sonora Town itself did not survive. The Southern Pacific put its depot and its rail yard on the edge of the district. Land values rose, the adobes came down, and warehouses went up. Families moved east across the river to Belvedere and Boyle Heights and City Terrace as the streetcar lines opened that land. By the 1930s, the barrio that had been the original one was mostly gone, and what remained of it downtown was the square, the church, and the crumbling block of houses on the alley behind them. That alley is the reason any of this is still standing. The woman who saved it also built, on the street running north out of that square, the version of Mexican Los Angeles that the city preferred to the one it was in the middle of removing. The people in that square in 1931 were there because American industry had spent 30 years asking them to come. That is not a sympathetic reading of the period. It is the recruiting policy. Between 1910 and 1920, the Mexican Revolution pushed something close to a tenth of Mexico's population across the border, and the American Southwest was ready for them. The Southern Pacific and the Santa Fe hired Mexican track crews by the thousand and moved them along the lines in boxcars fitted out as housing. Growers in the Imperial and San Joaquin valleys built their entire labor calendar around seasonal Mexican crews. In 1917, the United States entered the war, the labor market emptied, and the federal government waived the head tax and the literacy test for Mexican workers entering to do agricultural and railroad work. The waiver was renewed after the war ended. In Los Angeles, the work was the brickyards, the citrus packing houses, the canneries, the cement plants, and the streetcar track gangs. The Simon's Brick Company ran a company town of Mexican workers east of the city, with its own school and its own store and its own baseball team, and it supplied a large share of the brick that Los Angeles was built out of in those decades. When the Immigration Acts of 1921 and 1924 set hard quotas on Europe and Asia, they left the Western Hemisphere alone, and the flow from Mexico became the flow that fed the region. By 1930, the census counted a Mexican population in Los Angeles larger than that of any city outside Mexico. They were not concentrated in one place. They were in Belvedere and Boyle Heights, in the Flats, in Watts, in the beet fields at the county line, in the company towns, and in the old blocks around the Plaza. They had mutual aid societies, Spanish-language newspapers, a consulate that took its protective duties seriously, and by the end of the decade, a radio show. Pedro Gonzalez went on the air in Los Angeles at 4 in the morning and came off at 6, playing to men getting dressed for work. His group was called Los Madrugadores, the Early Risers, named for exactly that audience, and by the early 1930s, he was the most listened to Spanish-language voice in Southern California. He would matter a great deal in 1931, and it would cost him nearly everything. None of this was a secret from anyone. The city knew who had built it. What the city did next was to sell that knowledge back to tourists while denying it to the people who had earned it. Christine Sterling arrived in Los Angeles in 1926 from Oakland, having read the promotional literature that sold Southern California as a Spanish garden. She went looking for the old town and found an alley of collapsing buildings north of the Plaza, and in the middle of it, a mud brick house from 1818 with a condemnation notice on the door. The house belonged to the descendants of Francisco Avila, and it was the oldest surviving house in the city. Sterling spent 2 years trying to save it. She wrote to the council and got nowhere. Then she built a sign 12 feet across, planted it in front of the Avila adobe, and had it read as a question put to the city about whether this was really the building Los Angeles wanted to condemn. She tipped off the newspapers anonymously about her own sign. The story ran, the pressure came, and the council reversed the demolition order. The man who made the rest of it possible was Harry Chandler, the publisher of the Los Angeles Times, who put his paper behind her. In July of 1929, Sterling held a luncheon on the patio of the Adobe for city officials and businessmen and described what she wanted to build. The chief of police offered her prison labor. Blue Diamond Cement and the Simon's Brick Company offered materials. Money came in from men whose names were on downtown buildings. By September of that year, the council had authorized closing the street. Work began on the 7th of November, 1929, 13 days after the stock market crash. Between 25 and 50 prisoners did the building. Sterling kept a diary and noted with satisfaction that when she needed a carpenter, or an electrician, or a bricklayer, one would generally be arrested soon enough. The street reopened on Easter Sunday, 1930. The press called it a Mexican street of yesterday in the city of today. Sterling ran it as managing director, and she ran it closely. She approved each merchant personally. She required costumes, she required guitars, she hired actors to sit about the place in the character of Mexican peasants. The stalls were called PWES toes, and she filled them with Mexican goods sold by Mexican families under conditions she set. And within a few years, the street was drawing close to 2 million visitors a year. Set that against what was happening 200 feet away. The street sold a version of Mexican Los Angeles that had been dead for 80 years, tidied up and made safe, at the precise moment that the living version was being loaded onto trains. Sterling was not a hypocrite in the ordinary sense. She fought for those families, and several of their descendants still trade on that street and speak of her with real warmth. She simply built a museum of a people while the city was removing the people, and the city found the arrangement extremely comfortable. There is one more thing to know about the timing. The street opened in April of 1930. The raid came in February of 1931. In between, the country ran out of work. By the winter of 1930 to 31, roughly 1 in 4 American workers had no job. Relief was a county responsibility, and the counties were going broke. And the explanation that arrived, in newspapers and in council chambers and in Congress, was that the jobs had been taken. William Doak became Secretary of Labor in December of 1930. The Bureau of Immigration reported to him, and he announced that there were 400,000 foreigners in the country illegally, of whom perhaps 100,000 could be deported, and that removing them would open the same number of jobs for Americans. The arithmetic was invented. The Bureau had no basis for either figure and never produced one. Here is what the law actually allowed. Deportation was a legal process. It required an arrest on a specific statutory ground, a warrant obtained from Washington, a hearing before an immigration inspector, and a record. It was slow, it was expensive, and in the great majority of cases involving Mexican residents of California, it would have failed, because the people concerned had entered legally under the wartime waivers, or under a border regime that had barely been policed at all. A large share of them were not deportable by any reading of the statute. A larger share still could not be touched, because they had been born in the United States and were citizens. Doak's department knew all of this. So did the district office in Los Angeles. Which is why what was tried in Los Angeles in 1931 was not, in the main, deportation. It was advertising. The plan came out of an office that had nothing to do with immigration. Charles Wiesel ran the Los Angeles Citizens Committee on Coordination of Unemployment Relief, a body set up to deal with the jobless, and in January of 1931, he wired Washington with a proposal. His words in his own telegram were that it would be a great relief to the unemployment situation if some method could be devised to scare these people out of our city. The method he devised was publicity. He would announce a deportation campaign loudly, through the newspapers and the radio, and then stage a small number of highly visible arrests. He explained the point of it to Doak without any coyness at all. This apparent activity, he wrote, would have a tendency to scare many thousand alien deportables out of this district, which was the result desired. Note the phrase, apparent activity. He was not promising Washington enforcement. He was promising Washington the appearance of enforcement, and telling them plainly that the appearance was the product. Washington agreed. Walter Carr, the district director of immigration in Los Angeles, was brought in to supply the federal muscle and the federal name. Carr dealt with the charitable organizations that were already objecting by referring to them in the press as so-called sob sisters, and calling for experienced men to be put in charge instead. The campaign opened in the third week of January. On the 26th, the Los Angeles Illustrated Daily News carried the line the committee wanted carried, which was that aliens who were deportable would save themselves trouble and expense by arranging their departure at once. That sentence is the entire policy. It is an instruction to self-deport, printed in an English-language newspaper in a city where the target population reads Spanish. They read it anyway. La Opinión, the Spanish daily, told its readers in late January where to obtain copies of their passports quickly and warned them what was coming. Pedro Gonzalez said it on the radio before dawn. The Mexican consul, Rafael de la Colina, tried to calm his community by pointing out that people with legal status were protected by the immigration laws and should not feel alarmed. For a few days, that held. It was the correct advice. It came from the right office, and there was no reason yet to think that a document issued by the United States government would not be honored by an officer of the United States government. It was worthless anyway. Children stopped going to school. Families stopped going out after dark. Shops on Main Street reported their trade collapsing. All of that happened before a single officer had entered a single square, purely on the strength of the announcement, which is precisely what the announcement had been designed to do. What the campaign still needed was one demonstration in a place where everybody would see it. They chose the Plaza, and they chose it deliberately. Francisco Balderrama and Raymond Rodriguez, whose book on the period is the standard account, described the site as chosen for its maximum psychological impact in what they call a war of nerves against the Mexican community. It was the one place in Los Angeles where the largest number of people would witness the thing directly, and from which word would travel outward fastest, into every neighborhood in the county by nightfall. The 26th of February was a Thursday. In the middle of the afternoon, the square held roughly 400 people, most of them men out of work, some of them women with children, vendors selling food, a few speakers, the usual traffic of a public square in a city with an unemployment rate near a quarter. At 3 o'clock, the officers came in through both entrances and closed them. Federal immigration officers, uniformed Los Angeles police, and men from the police department's anti-radical unit, the squad the city called the Red Squad. Some wore olive uniforms, some wore ordinary suits. They carried guns and they carried batons. People were made to line up or told to stay seated. Then the questioning started, bench by bench, and La Opinión recorded exactly what was asked. The immigration employees asked the detainees their name, their age, how long they had lived in the United States, where they had entered, and whether or not they had a job. Then they demanded their passports. Several people tried to get out. Witnesses said they were beaten. Word reached the Mexican consulate, and two vice consuls, Ricardo Hill and Joel Quinones, went straight to the square. Officers turned them away at the line and kept turning them away until the two men produced their diplomatic rank. Afterwards, Quinones went to Walter Carr to protest, and Carr told him he had no knowledge of any raid. The district director of immigration, on the day of the operation his own office had staged, in the city he ran it from. The questioning went on for something over an hour. 17 people were taken to the central police station. 11 of those were Mexican, and 9 of the 11 were released almost at once, having proved they were lawfully in the country. 5 of the 17 were Chinese, 1 was Japanese. Moises Gonzalez was among the 11. He had lived and worked in Los Angeles legally since 1923, and he had the documents in his coat, and he still sat in a cell until the evening while officers discussed whether to hold him as a radical. Then everybody went home, and La Opinion put on the record why the streets around the square had emptied. The panic caused by the presence of the immigration authorities in the neighborhood, the paper wrote, was such that Main Street was deserted within a few minutes and stayed deserted for several hours. That is the raid. 400 questioned, 17 held, 9 of them freed the same day, and a small number eventually removed from the country. If you were grading it as an enforcement operation, you would call it a failure and shut the program down. Nobody shut it down because nobody was grading it as an enforcement operation. Set the numbers against the stated aim, and they stop looking like a failure at all. The cell had told Washington in writing that what he wanted was apparent activity that would scare many thousands of people out of the district. 400 people were questioned in public, in the most public place available, by armed men who blocked the exits. Every one of those 400 had a family, a boarding house, a work gang, a parish. The information traveled that night. Sweeps continued through the spring at other locations, including Japanese and Russian districts, though the pressure fell overwhelmingly on Mexican neighborhoods. La Opinion noted a detail that recurred through all of it, which was that in case after case, the people picked up proved to have been duly and legally admitted. The paper was reporting it as a scandal. Read from the committee's side of the desk, it was not a defect in the method. It was the method working, because a raid that only frightened people who were actually deportable would have frightened almost nobody. While that was going on in the streets, the state of California closed the other door. In 1931, the legislature passed what became known as the Alien Labor Act, which barred any contractor working on a public job for the state, a county, or a city from employing anyone who was not a citizen. In an ordinary year, that would have been an insult. In 1931, it was something else, because public works were very nearly the only new employment being created anywhere in the country. Road crews, storm drains, school buildings, the whole visible response of American government to the Depression ran through public contracts. And the men who had laid the track and fired the brick kilns of Southern California were now legally ineligible for the one kind of work that was expanding. Hundreds lost jobs they already held. Then, having removed them from the payroll, the county treated their appearance at the relief office as evidence of something. Men who did what any unemployed American did, which was to go and ask for help, found themselves described in the local press as a burden, and in some quarters as agitators. Pedro Gonzalez was still on air at 4 in the morning, telling them what was coming. Think about what that leaves. No private work, because the private economy had stopped. No public work by statute. Relief that came with a caseworker attached and a suggestion in her briefcase. And a police force that had just demonstrated in the middle of the city what it was prepared to do in a public square on a Thursday afternoon. The Mexican consulate in Los Angeles fought it, and the record of that fight is one of the stranger parts of this history. The consul, Rafael de la Colina, and his vice consuls protested the raids, demanded the release of citizens and lawful residents, and pushed relief funds toward Mexican families who had been cut off. They also, at the same time, helped organize the departures, negotiating fares and arranging for arriving families to be received on the other side. Mexico's government under Pascual Ortiz Rubio was actively encouraging the return, advertising land in new agricultural colonies to people it described as coming home. Most of those colonies failed within a few years, and the families in them had nothing to go back to in either direction. Both governments had reasons to prefer that the movement be understood as voluntary. Only one of them had blocked the exits of a public square to make it so. By March, families across Los Angeles County were selling furniture. By March, the welfare offices were busy in a way they had not been before. And in Washington later that same year, a federal commission looked at how immigration enforcement was being conducted across the country and used language that appears almost nowhere else in a government report of the period. In October of 1931, the Wickersham Commission described the methods as unconstitutional, tyrannic, and oppressive, and found that people had been removed without the process the law required. That report changed nothing in Los Angeles, and the reason is that by October, the federal deportation drive in the city had largely stopped. The county had found something cheaper, and what it had found was not deportation at all. Here is how the machine worked once the raids had done their job. Deportation is a federal act with a legal shape. There is a charge, a hearing, an order, and a record. And the person removed has been through a process that can be appealed, and that leaves a paper trail. Repatriation is not a legal act at all. It is a person voluntarily leaving the country, and it produces no charge, no hearing, no order, and almost no record. The person who goes has not been found to have done anything. They have simply gone. For a county government facing a relief bill it could not pay, the second thing had every advantage over the first. It was faster, it was far cheaper, it required no cooperation from any court, and it left nothing behind that anyone could later be asked to answer for. So Los Angeles County built a system to produce voluntary departures. The welfare department hired Spanish-speaking staff and sent them into Mexican households on relief. The offer they carried was not framed as an offer. Families were informed that their relief would be discontinued and that the county would pay their train fare to Mexico if they accepted it now. Some were told the assistance was ending in any case. Hospital patients were moved by stretcher into vehicles bound for the border. Where a family had a member who was dying, the county was prepared to cover burial costs on the other side. Petra Sanchez Rocha was sent to Mexico after a breakdown. Her family told that her recovery could only be achieved there. That was the register of the whole thing. Nothing was ever phrased as removal. It was phrased as help, as reunion, as going home, and it was directed at people for whom Mexico was, in many cases, not home, and never had been. None of it needed a warrant, because none of it was legally an expulsion. And that is the thing to hold on to, because it is why the record is so thin, and why it took 70 years to get anything approaching an admission out of any government in California. There was no order to produce. There was no court to appeal to. There was a train ticket and a caseworker at the door. The first county train pulled out of Los Angeles on the 23rd of March, 1931, 4 weeks after the raid on the Plaza, carrying about 350 people. The county called them repatriation trains and ran them as a regular service. By the end of 1933, there had been 15 of them, carrying 12,786 people. Counting to the 5th of April 1934, the relief agencies of Los Angeles County had shipped 13,332 people to Mexico. Across the whole period, something on the order of 35,000 people left Los Angeles, roughly a third of the city's Mexican population. The county wrote down why. Officials calculated that moving 6,000 people to Mexico would cost the county about $77,000, and that keeping those same 6,000 on unemployment relief for a year would cost about $425,000. The difference is $348,000, which works out at $58 a head for making a person leave the county permanently rather than feeding them in it for a year. The healthcare they were using was itemized too. Set that against the fact that a large share of the people in that calculation were United States citizens with a legal right to relief in the county where they had been born, and the arithmetic becomes the whole story of the decade in one line of a ledger. The departures themselves were public events. A Los Angeles minister named Alan Hunter went down to watch one of the trains leave and described later what the platform felt like, which was hopelessness, and said that they had a feeling of it being totally unjust. He also said that he wished he had done more, which is the sentence that turns up again and again in the oral histories of people who were adults and Anglo and in the city at the time. The radio host kept broadcasting against it. In 1934, Pedro Gonzalez was arrested and convicted on a rape charge brought by a teenage girl who later stated that officials had promised to keep her out of reform school if she accused him. The judge refused to admit her statement. Gonzalez served 6 years in San Quentin and was released in 1940 on condition that he leave the United States. He went to Tijuana and started a radio station there, and his story was filmed in 1988 as Break of Dawn. The counter case deserves stating plainly because the numbers in this story have been fought over for 50 years, and the fight is a real one. Movement between Mexico and the United States had always been circular. People came for a season and went back, came for 3 years and went back. And the border in the 1920s was barely policed in either direction. A great many of the people who returned to Mexico between 1929 and 1936 went for the reason people always went, which is that there was no work, and would have gone whether or not a single officer had ever walked into the plaza. The historians have landed in different places. Abraham Hoffman, whose 1974 study was the first serious archival account, arrived at a figure over 400,000 for the years to 1937. Valderrama and Rodriguez, working from consular records, welfare files, and interviews, concluded that as many as 1 million people went, and that around 60% of them were citizens. Joseph Dunn, a California state senator, used a figure of 1.8 million. Brian Grattan and Emily Merchant, working the census microdata in 2013, put the number who actually moved to Mexico in the 1930s at around 355,000, and stressed that a substantial share of that movement was the ordinary return migration of a bad economy rather than the product of any campaign. That range, from 355,000 to nearly 2 million, is not a small disagreement, and anyone who tells this story as though the top figure were settled is misleading you. The disagreement stops at the total. The federal government formally deported tens of thousands of Mexican nationals in these years under process. The Los Angeles County figures are not estimates at all, because they are the county's own bookkeeping, and the county wrote down what it was doing and what it expected to save by doing it. A federal commission called the methods unconstitutional in 1931. The state of California later concluded in statute that United States citizens were unlawfully removed, and the lowest credible estimate of American citizens caught up in the movement still runs to well over 100,000 people. The argument is about the size of the wrong. It has never seriously been about whether there was one. The trains carried families, and the majority of the people on them had never in their lives set foot in the country they were being sent to. The share of the repatriated who were American citizens is the single most important number in this story, and it is also the number the historians argue about hardest. Grattan and Merchant's census work puts American-born citizens at about 38% of those who left, with another 2% naturalized. Valderrama and Rodriguez, working from case files and oral histories rather than census aggregates, put it at 60%. Take the lowest defensible figure, and it still means that something approaching 2 people in 5 sent south in these years were Americans being removed from America. Most of them were children, because on either estimate the citizens caught in this were overwhelmingly the American-born sons and daughters of Mexican-born parents. Emilia Castañeda was born in Los Angeles. Her mother died, her father fell ill and could no longer work, and in 1935, when Emilia was 9 years old and starting the 4th grade, the county bought the family a ticket. What she remembered of the arrangement afterwards was that the family's house went, and that the money from it went into the cost of moving them out. In Mexico, they lived under a tree, and then in a tent, without running water. Emilia stopped going to school because she did not speak Spanish well enough, and the other children made it unbearable. Over the years that followed, the family moved 17 times. She was an American citizen throughout, and it made no difference to any of it, because there was nobody to show the fact to. As her 18th birthday came up, she decided to go back. Her godmother in Boyle Heights sent her birth certificate and the money for the fare. It was 1944, and the train north was full of soldiers. She had been gone 9 years. The phrase she used for what those years did to her was that she was ni de aquí, ni de allá, not from here, not from there. She said the children in Mexico had treated her as an American, and the Anglos at home treated her as Mexican, and that both of those were true statements about her, and neither of them left her anywhere to stand. Emilia's case is not unusual, and that is the point of telling it. Thousands of American-born children were taken out of the country in these years by parents who had been given a choice that was not a choice, and a great many of them could not get back, because a child born at home to Mexican parents in the 1920s often had no birth certificate anyone had ever filed for, and without the certificate, the border did not care what they said. For 70 years, no American government asked itself a single question about any of it, and the reason is the same reason the county chose the method in the first place. Nobody had been deported. On paper, everybody had gone home. The one place in Los Angeles where somebody said it out loud at the time, in public, at the size of a building, was a wall. In the spring of 1932, a little over a year after the raid, the people who ran Olvera Street commissioned a mural for the second-floor exterior wall of the Italian Hall, on the east side of the street, facing down onto the crowds. The painter was David Alfaro Siqueiros, who had been forced out of Mexico for his politics and was working in Los Angeles on a temporary visa. He was asked for a tropical scene. What he painted, and unveiled in October of 1932, was an overgrown jungle with a Mexican Indian bound to a double cross in the center of it. Above the cross was an American eagle. Off to the right, two armed revolutionaries had their rifles raised at the bird. It was 80 feet across, and it was hung directly over a street that had been built to sell a charming Mexico to visitors from Pasadena. The part of it visible from the street below was whitewashed within months. The rest went white before the end of the decade, and Siqueiros was gone from the country before the paint on the first coat had aged, his visa not renewed. Not censored through a court, not argued about in a hearing. Whitewashed, the way you would deal with graffiti. The paint did not hold, and neither did the silence, though both of them took about 40 years to give way. The whitewash was cheap, and the mural was strong, and by the late 1960s the paint had begun to peel, and the crucified figure had begun to come back through it. That is roughly the same decade in which the first historians started asking what had happened on the trains, and it is not a coincidence in any mystical sense. It was the same generation of Mexican Americans in the same city deciding that both things needed looking at. Getting the painting back took another 40 years, and a conservation program run by the Getty Conservation Institute, which found a ruin of a picture, faint and damaged, and chose to stabilize what was there rather than repaint it. The people who were on those trains had to wait almost as long for anyone to say anything at all. In the meantime, the street went on being the street, and for 2 generations of families in Los Angeles, it was something considerably better than a tourist trap. Casa La Golondrina opened on Olvera Street in a brick building from the 1850s, run by Consuelo Castillo de Bonzo, who had come north from Aguascalientes. It served Mexican food at a time when almost every restaurant in Los Angeles calling itself Mexican was actually serving Spanish food to Anglos, and de Bonzo used it as a stage for Mexican singers, dancers, and musicians. Dolores Del Rio ate there regularly, at the height of her fame, when there were not many rooms in Los Angeles where a Mexican film star could sit and be treated as the most important person present. A few doors down, the Guerrero family sold taquitos out of a stand they called Cielito Lindo, having started with no kitchen and no running water, cooking at home and carrying water from a nearby gas station. The line for that stand became a permanent feature of the street and stayed one for the rest of the century. If you grew up in Los Angeles between the 1950s and the 1980s, this is what Olvera Street was. It was where you were taken for the blessing of the animals at Easter, standing in a crowd with somebody's parrot screaming over your head. It was Las Posadas in December, the candlelit procession going up the street 9 nights running. It was a paper flower and a leather belt with your name stamped on it, and a bag of taquitos eaten standing up. 2 million people a year came, and a large share of them were local families for whom this was simply the place you went. And almost none of those families discussed what had happened in the square at the bottom of it. That silence is documented, and it is close to universal. People who had been on the trains as children came back in the 1940s, went to work, raised families 4 miles away, and did not tell their children. Some of them had come to believe that if they had been sent away, there must have been a reason. Others understood exactly what had been done and understood equally clearly that saying so out loud in Los Angeles was not safe. The square itself found a second use. In December of 1985, at a mass on the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, the priest of the Plaza Church declared the building a public sanctuary for Central American refugees. His name was Luis Olivares. Roughly 100,000 Salvadorans had reached the United States by then, and about half of them had come to Los Angeles, and the federal government's position was that they were not refugees at all. Olivares let them sleep in the pews. He organized food, medical care, schooling, and work, and 2 years later he extended the sanctuary to undocumented Mexicans as well, which no other sanctuary church in the country did. The federal government made its displeasure known, and made it known repeatedly. The same square, the same church. 54 years after officers stood in both entrances of the garden outside it and asked 400 people for their papers. That was the point at which the history began to be spoken about, and it took another 20 years to reach a statute book. Emilia Castañeda was in her late 70s when she sat down in a hearing room in Sacramento in 2003 and told the state of California what had been done to her at 9 years old. The hearings existed because Joseph Dunn, a state senator from Orange County, had heard about the repatriation from a staff member and could not find it in any textbook he owned. He is the same senator whose figure of 1.8 million sits at the top of the range the historians argue over. The people who came in to testify beside Emilia were in their 70s and 80s and had been children on the trains. 2 bills came out of it. The first was Senate Bill 670, the Apology Act for the 1930s Mexican Repatriation Program, and it was signed by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger on the 7th of October, 2005. The act states the finding that United States citizens and legal residents of Mexican descent were unconstitutionally removed and coerced into leaving the country, that this violated their basic civil liberties and constitutional rights, and that the state of California apologizes to them. It also required a plaque to be installed and maintained in an appropriate public place in Los Angeles. That was the only part of the act that required anyone to do anything. The second bill was Senate Bill 645, which would have created a commission to look at compensation for the survivors. The governor vetoed it. There was no compensation, and the courts had already closed the other route on the grounds that too much time had passed for a claim to be brought. So what the survivors received was an apology and a plaque, and the plaque took 7 more years. It went up in February of 2012 at La Plaza de Cultura y Artes, on the block between the square and the old church, a short walk from the benches. In the same month, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors passed its own formal apology for the county's part in the trains, on a recommendation from Supervisor Gloria Molina. 12 more years passed, and in September of 2024, the governor signed legislation to fund a permanent memorial to the repatriation. That proposal had come from a high school student's research paper. Read the sequence in one breath, and it is its own argument. The state apologized in 2005, 74 years after the raid. The county apologized in 2012, by which time almost everybody who had been an adult on a train was dead. Compensation was vetoed and then time-barred. The memorial is being built by a generation with no personal memory of any of it, for a generation that mostly did not live to see it. The plaque went up 100 yards from the place it is about, on a block that 2 million visitors a year were walking past at the time. The square is still a square, with trees and benches and paths across it. The Plaza Church on its west side is still a working parish. As of the summer of 2026, the Avila Adobe, the house with the condemnation notice on the door, was still the oldest house in Los Angeles, and was still open to the public without charge, exactly as Christine Sterling intended, about 100 feet from where the officers formed their line. Olvera Street still runs north out of the square with its stalls down the middle of it, and some of the families have been on it for 3 generations. As of the summer of 2026, the trade was in a bad way, and the merchants were saying so publicly. One stallholder, from a family that has traded on the street for generations, told a reporter in July of that year that immigration enforcement had driven away half of the customer base, because half of the customer base was the local Latino community. Another, who had worked the street for 16 years, described the weekdays as simply empty. A third, whose family booth has been there since the 1960s, said that where they used to open at 8 in the morning and close at 11 at night, they now come in at 10 and leave by 4. Above the street, on the wall of the Italian Hall, the ruin of the mural sits under a shelter built to keep the weather off it, and a viewing platform stands on the roof of a building across the way. It opened to the public in October of 2012, 80 years to the day after Siqueiros first uncovered the painting, and in the summer of 2026, it was open 5 days a week, free, to anybody who wanted to climb the stairs. A city relief committee and a federal immigration office sealed that square together in 1931 because sealing it was cheaper than obeying the law, and the arithmetic was written down in the county's own files at the time. 17 people were arrested that afternoon, and almost all of them were let go, because arresting people was never the plan. The plan was written in a telegram in January of 1931 by a relief administrator who wanted apparent activity, and it worked exactly as designed. 400 people were frightened in public so that tens of thousands would leave without a hearing, without an order, and without leaving a record that any government would have to answer for. On the most conservative count, something close to 2 in 5 of the people who went were American citizens, and most of those were American-born children. Historians working from case files put the share higher. Nobody was ever charged with anything, because in the eyes of the law, nothing was done to anybody. The square is still there, and so is the church. And so is the oldest house in Los Angeles, still free to walk into, still a short walk from the benches where 400 people were asked to prove they belonged in the city their families had built. Walk down from the church to the bottom of Olvera Street and stand where the 2 entrances were. The benches are a few steps one way, and the adobe is a few steps the other. Between them, on the wall above, is the painting the city whitewashed, of a man on a cross under an American eagle, put up by a painter whose own visa ran out the same year. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button in the middle to watch more forgotten places and abandoned history from across America. Then click the video on the left to watch similar stories like this. Or if you really want to get stuck in, click the playlist on the right. New videos every week. I'll see you in the next one.